When compositing a scene like this, it really comes down to assessing what you have, recalling your creative intent, and using your render passes in a way that elevates the story that you set out to tell. So in this case, I started by setting up and integrating a couple of light groups. Before integrating the light groups, we first need to set them up. You can't use what you don't have. So first of all, in Maya and within the Arnold render view, you'll see that I've done a test render, which is always a good idea to confirm your AOVs are outputting correctly, including your light groups. Now to check those, we can just go up to the View AOVs drop down here, and you'll see a list of all of the active AOVs within the scene. And so looking at these, you'll see I've included a kind of mix of different types of AOVs or passes. We have emission, indirect, direct, diffuse, specular, cryptomats, and then the light groups at the top. And so some of these are more component AOVs, whether that would be the specular or diffuse pass, for example. And then some of them are more utility passes, which would be like the Z depth or the cryptomats, for example. And so the utility passes, unlike the component passes, aren't directly part of the final beauty result, but they do help a lot in compositing. And so they're often helpful to have regardless, just in case. But now if we look at the RGBA_moon and lamp AOVs, those are the light group AOVs as indicated by the RGBA_ prefix. So if we just look at the moon result, that's what that looks like. And then if we look at the lamp result, that's what that looks like. And so in this scene, in this case, I decided to split my light groups up into just two light groups based off of the two primary light sources within the scene, which would be the natural moonlight, both the indirect and directional coming from that, and then also the lamp light. Again, both the bounce light that I've set up for that as well as the direct coming from the primary lamp source. I felt that gave me a good balance of kind of simplicity as well as flexibility after the fact in comp. Now, of course, you can set these up however you want. You can get kind of as granular as you would like. You might want to do that by splitting them up into the natural, practical, and artistic lights, and maybe you would have a little bit more light groups than I did here if you did that. Or you can maybe set it up into indirect, direct kind of lights based off of the light sources that are present in the scene. Or maybe there's other ways you want to do it as well. I just decided to go with two in this case. Now, to assign lights to these corresponding AOVs, this lamp AOV as well as this moon AOV, you just want to go to the outliner, or you can go to the viewport if you want as well, if that's more accessible. And then just click on your lights. So I just went to my area bounce light for my moonlight here, just found within the natural lights group. And then I made sure to add that to the moon light group just by going down to the visibility drop down in the light attributes in the attribute editor here, and then just typed in moon. And then I just copied that and pasted it in here for the window dome light, which I went over in the last video. Made sure that was there. And then also in the primary dome light, you'll see that there, as well as the directional moonlight right there. And that's just creating that light shape on the ground effectively. Also some highlights in this area of the frame, but that's also active on the moonlight light group. Now, if we open up the lamp lights, you'll see that I've added it to the rim light right there, lamp, and then also the skip light. And then if we open up the mesh light, it's there as well. And so that will ensure that it is being assigned to the corresponding light group AOVs. You just need that main name of the light group. You do not need the RGBA prefix. The name will suffice, and it's enough to assign it to the light group. So I'm just going to close those. Now, if we go over to the render settings, this is how you actually make the AOVs themselves. So first of all, you'll just go over to the AOVs tab, and then you'll see a list of the available AOVs within Arnold here, just the defaulted kind of list of AOVs. And then this is the list of my active AOVs. So this corresponds to that drop-down list. These would be the same ones here that we see right here. And so to create these light group AOVs in this list, I just went add custom, clicked on that button, typed in RGBA_moon and then lamp, and then clicked create AOV for each of those. And then it added them to the list of active AOVs. And it's as simple as that. Now you'll also see there's an RGBA option here for your available AOVs. Now this defaulted AOV is just effectively used for the beauty pass. It's kind of just like an additional beauty pass. If you wanted that, that's all it acts as. So you couldn't alternatively just add this by clicking these arrows into your active list and then maybe try renaming it. because this setup relies on metadata that only comes along with custom AOVs as they are created. So you would want to make sure that you are using this option to do so. And that should be enough to hook everything up. Now we have our active light group AOVs. We have our lights that should then be applied to those. They should be assigned to those based off of the name that we have in the AOV light group input box. And we should be good to go. Now there's just a couple last things to bring up before we move into Blender here. So first of all, I denoised the final image. I applied some denoising right out of Arnold to the RGBA or beauty pass, the master layer pass. And so to do that, there's a couple of ways to go about it. You can do that through the Arnold render view itself, just by going to the post tab here in the post effects. So if you don't have those visible, you can just click on the display settings button here. That should pop those out. And then you go to the post tab, add imager, click on denoise or noise, and then that should add this guy right there. You'll see it comes with a few settings. I have another video where I go over this more in depth, so feel free to check that out. But I just dialed these in, and then by default, it should just be applying, I believe, just to the RGBA or the beauty pass. So if you went and looked at the beauty pass, that should look denoised by default without changing any of these settings. But if you look at the light group AOVs, those would probably still look noisy. So you would want to make sure those are also denoised. In order to do that, what you can do is go to this common dropdown and then click on select AOVs. And then you would just hold option or command, depending on what OS you're on. And then select the AOVs you want to have denoised. So in this case, RGBA and then the moon and lamp group AOVs. And then I just clicked OK, and you'll see that those would then appear here in this input box separated by OR. And if that's the case, then they should be getting denoised. I would just do another render to make sure that they are. And then, yeah, we're golden. So there's a couple ways you can do that as well. So you can either add it here in the Arnold render view, or you can add it in the Arnold renderer tab in the render settings under imager. From there, you would just go about it through the same process. Click on add imager. This dropdown will pop up. Select denoise or noise. And then if you click on it there, you'll see some settings pop up in the attribute editor. It's the same settings. So if you change any of these here, they'll also change here. That's how you would denoise it though. From there, all we have to do is save out the image. And so what we'd have to do is just go File, Save Multilayer EXR. That is one option. Now, just a heads up, if you do that, it will not retain the necessary metadata to use, for example, your crypto mats, if you decided you did in fact want to use those in the comp stage. So I would be mindful of that. Now, if it is just a single frame render, maybe for a personal project or what have you, that might be okay. If that is the case, you can often just do any kind of isolated adjustments similar to what you would do with crypto mats, just in Lightroom or Photoshop, and that would suffice. But it is always nice to have them, and if it doesn't add too much work, then why not? Especially though, if you're doing any kind of animation, you'll want to include those. So to do that in a way that will retain the metadata so that you can use those crypto mats, what you would have to do is render it through the render menu at the top. You'd want to make sure you're in the rendering drop-down mode effectively in Maya, and then go to the render menu at the top, and then you can either go to render sequence, click on the options box if you want, that'll bring up some options, or batch render. You can also click on the options box there, and that'll bring up some options. Or it looks like Arnold doesn't have any batch render options. So to do this when using Arnold to render, you would just change your default render settings to accommodate for a batch render basically. So you want to go to the comment tab, make sure everything is set up properly here as intended. So in regards to the directory you have on your hard drive on your computer where you want it rendered out, you want to go to the comment tab, make sure the path is specified correctly into that project. If it's not, and you don't have a project or it's set incorrectly, you would go to the file menu and then go click on the project window. And then that's where you can kind of create a new project, specify where you want that to go. And then by default, it should be going somewhere into the images directory inside of that project on your hard drive. Now, if you already have a project created and for some reason it's set elsewhere, you'll probably already know in this case, but then you would just go to the file menu and then go set project, locate that primary project directory and set it. From there, you'd go to the top here. There's a file name prefix under File Output, input box, where you can specify any kind of subdirectory setup that you want. It's just based off of the slashes that you might want to add there. And then you can add any kind of naming convention as well. If you right click, there's some defaulted options. It'll just adjust relative to those names within your scene. And then you can also just customize it here too. So I just added Vickery Attic _, and then you'll get a preview of what that looks like in the file name section at the top in regards to where that would go and what the file would ultimately be called. And then now going down under the metadata, I just have it set to single frame. If you change it to any of these, that'll be more for any kind of animation where it's multiple frames. But since I have it set to single frame, the frame range is grayed out. And then I've set my camera to the render cam camera. And the image size for that, I've just set my resolution to 4K, 3840 by 2160. And that's it. So I'm kind of good to go there. Just a quick look at my render settings right there. What do I have for filter? Gaussian. Ray depth is that. Could have adjusted these maybe a little bit further. Since I'm using denoising, I might have not needed quite as many samples, but regardless, it's just a single frame kind of personal project setup. Got the job done just fine. But from there, we're good to go. So we can just batch render that. We would just go render, batch render. When you do that, it'll go to, again, that directory that you specified, and then you should see the progress of that batch render in the kind of command line down here at the bottom of the Maya UI in regards to the percentage that it's done. And you can also confirm that it is going to the right directory there by looking at the command line. If you want a more in-depth look of the history of the progress of that batch render, you can open up the script editor and it should show you that kind of progressively as it renders the image. So that's it. Now that we have gone over the light group setup and getting those in place, now we can actually go into the more integration part of the light groups and kind of jump into Blender and start comping this thing. All right, so here we are in Blender. This is Blender, as you can see, 4.3.2. So if you're following along, if you have any kind of recent version of Blender, should be just fine. But now we can start actually looking at compositing this multi-layer EXR result that we would have now rendered out. And first off, again, we can start by adding those light group AOVs so that we can rebuild that final combined beauty result. And we'll start from there. Now, first of all, you'll see I have this specific paneled layout set up within my Blender. And so to achieve this kind of layout, what I did was just pull out these panels. So if you go to the top left corner of any panel within Blender, you'll see this crosshair. And then if you just drag down or to the side, it should pull out a new panel. And now it'll be easier to drag out either horizontally or vertically the closer you are to the edge of said panel. If you're closer to the center area of the panel and then try to pull up or down or side to side, it won't change the orientation of the panel. You have to be closer to the edge to kind of see that happen. But when you do that and then let go of the left mouse click, you'll see a new panel come up, and then you can just change the panel view to whatever you would like. But I'm just going to right click here. Command is apparently held down. I'm going to hit that and undo it. There we go. I'm just going to right click and then join that back to the left. There we go. And so I just did that until I had this general layout overall regarding my panels. And then I changed the top panel to the image editor and then the bottom one to the compositor panel. And then made sure I had use nodes checked off as well. And now we are ready to go and start compositing. So first of all, the primary node to look at first would be this. This would have existed in isolation before I built out the rest of this pipe. I would have just dragged the render from the directory that I rendered it to on my hard drive into the compositor panel in Blender here, and then it would have just shown up as an image node. It would have just automatically sourced the path down here. If we just click on that, it would go directly to where I saved it. And then we should be able to see it with all of the active AOVs listed within it as well, which is kind of an indicator that it worked in regards to it rendering out as a multi-layer EXR. You should be able to hold Control-Shift and then just kind of preview the result that we get from each of those corresponding AOVs. And so now if we look at the combined result, it looks like it did where we left off when we were setting up those light groups, and where we left off at the end of the last video where I went over the lighting, my lighting setup for this scene. And so this is what we are starting with. And so now I'm just going to take you through the process of how I went from this effective result to this result here, looking at the end of the pipe, where it looks like this. So this is closer, more in line with that final result that we were looking at initially when I went over establishing the creative direction. I used those volumetric render layers to kind of add in the added layer of volumetrics on top of that base layer of subtle volumetrics using the dome light that was effectively baked into that combined result. And so I just layered those in and adjusted them, fine-tuned them a little bit to work within the context of this scene while pushing toward that final creative direction goal or target look. Now, I also made a few other adjustments in regards to the coloring of certain elements within the scene. I did some vignetting as well, amongst a few other small adjustments. So we'll go over that next, starting with the light group integration into the comp pipe. And so let's just go down here. And so we'll see those again as indicated by the RGBA_ prefix. We have the lamp light group and the moon light group. So now it's just a matter of mixing them together to achieve the same result that we see here. Since these are in fact the only two active light groups within the scene, after you combine them, mix them, merge them, what have you, that result should match the same result that we see here within the combined result, that final beauty output that we got out of Maya. And so if we just go Shift A, search for a mix node, and then plug in the moon into the bottom image input and the lamp into the top. It doesn't matter which goes into the top or the bottom. Just as a heads up, whatever AOV or output does go into the bottom image input will be layered on top effectively. It's kind of backwards, doesn't make a lot of sense, but you get used to it. And then what we're going to want to do is change the blending mode to add, and then we can just Control-Shift left click on that again. It'll move our viewer over there, indicating that we are then viewing that. It'll take a second for it to load in sometimes, depending on how much you have prior in your comp pipe. So there it actually loaded in pretty quick. So that does match now, if we look at the combined result, 1-to-1 with that. And so that's exactly what we want. Now, it might be an indicator that you might have missed adding some lights to your corresponding light group AOVs. If you view this result with them combined and it doesn't match that, then it might be a matter of going back to Maya, checking to make sure all of your lights that you've intended to affect the final result are actually assigned to the proper AOVs for those lights. So I just created that for demonstration purposes. Now if we go over here, that's effectively the same thing that's happening here with this mix node. I just have a few adjustments, a couple of them happening to the lamp light group AOV. The moonlight group is just piping right into that bottom image input, and then it's just being added on top of the lamp light group. And so on the lamp light group, I just have an adjustment that's removing some speck from this picture frame here, that strong hit. It was a little bit distracting, so I just wanted to remove that. And then I'm also creating a very subtle vignette effect that's just diminishing the effect of the lamplight on the outer edges of the frame to kind of try to pull the eye a little bit more towards the center focal point, being the work desk. And so going over those adjustments quickly, you'll see I've created a CryptoMatte node here. Again, you would just search for that, Shift A, search, type in CryptoMatte. You can use the legacy one or this one. In this case, I just used a CryptoMatte node and I set it to image since I'm not using an actual render that I've output or that I currently have within Blender. I'm just using an image that I've brought into the Blender compositor, right? And so when you click this drop down here, it'll list any active images or renders that you might have within your compositor panel within Blender. And so since the only image node we have with an active render is the Vickery Attic file that I saved out here, it came up with that. So I just selected it. And since I batch rendered it, it has all the necessary metadata with it. It has the active AOVs within it as well. And so it recognizes that. This CryptoMatte node is seeing that. And so we can now see the options of the CryptoMattes that we have available to us, which is the asset, material, and object-based CryptoMattes. And so I just went with the asset one here. That did the trick. And so then I went and viewed the picker, the pick option here, that output. And then we see that multicolored result from that CryptoMatte. And now to make a selection based off of this, I just clicked the plus button here and then an eyedropper came up. I clicked on the picture frame. And then when I did that, it added it to the matte ID list for the selection, as you can see here. And then to preview what that matte looks like, we can just go again, Control-Shift left click on the matte. And then we can see the matte that has created. So that's exactly what I want. And then I just created a math node here, searched for it, created it, changed the operation to greater than, and that kind of made it a solid alpha. Without that, since it was glass that I was selecting, where that spec hit was showing up on, it wasn't a solid alpha or matte selection. So to adjust that, to fix that, I just created that math node, set it to greater than, and then inverted it. And that gave me a solid alpha, solid matte. And then pipe that into the factor and use that again just as a mask effectively. Then from there, you'll see what's going into the bottom image input, right? Because that will be layered on top, right? So the specular here is being layered on top using the subtract function, right? So that's being layered on top, it's being isolated, and then it's subtracting the matte area, that selection, from the specular result. It's taking that and it's subtracting effectively that highlight, because that's really all that's showing up on the specular pass or AOV. It's then subtracting it from the result that is going into the top image input and being layered underneath, which is this. So it's just removing that spec hit and only that spec hit. So if we view this, you'll see that the lamp light group looks the same. Otherwise, all that was removed is just that spec hit. So that's how you can remove certain types of specularity, and that's why it's good to include those component passes, even if you're not using them to completely reassemble that final result to match the combined result. They're still useful to be able to adjust certain elements within your final result nonetheless. Now, this lamp light group plus vignette adjustment here is just taking the lamp light group. Again, that's being piped in directly into the bottom image input of this mix. So again, it's being put on top. And then we have this mask right here, this rough kind of roto shape that I've created. That's being piped into this blur, which is changed to Gaussian. And then I've adjusted the X and Y amounts to 550 respectively. And then I piped this result into the factor. And so what's happening here then is whatever is white relative to this mask is going to reveal whatever's plugged into the bottom image input, again, because that is layered on top. And then anything that is black or sitting within the black region will reveal whatever's being piped into the top image input, which is ultimately layering underneath of the original lamp light group result. And so what is being layered underneath or plugged into the top image input is this result here. And so what's happening here, if we look at that compared to the original lamp group result, is that lamp light group is being piped into the bottom image input of this mix on top of just a black solid effectively. And then it's being reduced. The factor is reduced to almost half, 0.567. I just dragged that until it looked about right. And then it's just darkening the overall result. And so what that would do is it would just darken whatever part of the lamp light group is lying within the black region of this mask here. And so it's just kind of diminishing or darkening the lamp light group only on the outer edges of the frame, creating a very subtle vignette effect. Now in hindsight, I might have reduced it a little bit more than I did. I might have just brought the factor up all the way so the outer edge was just completely black. Like this is 0.567. If we go to 1 to show what that looks like a little bit more clearly, that's what it looks like there, right? So if we go from this, oh no, wait, that's different. That's not what I intended to do. If we go to the 0, it's just going to be black completely. And then if we go here, that's what it looks like, right? So that's the general effect. I just didn't want it to be too stark, so I wanted to pipe in the original lamp light group result into the bottom image input. Otherwise, we wouldn't have even needed to do this. If we have this result here, we could have just like taken this and just removed it, had a mix node. And then if we view this, it's still just going to be black, or it should be. Yeah. And that's only because the factor's at 0. If we drag this up again, then it'll be white because the white's on the bottom, ultimately being layered on top. So if we drag this on top, it's going to be white. And so then to fix that, we could just keep the factor at 1 and alternatively change this to black. And then that'll give us the same result there. And then that might look a little different when we mix it together, where the lamp light group is mixing with the moon light group. So there you go. It's a little more noticeable, and now it looks a little bit more jarring though and unnatural because we've completely cut out that effect from that region, and it's kind of more noticeable in relation to that mask and that feathering that exists on it from that Gaussian blur that's being applied to it. So I would revert that, and I will in fact do that here quickly. So I'll just plug that into the bottom image input and then change this to 0.567 and make it a little more subtle. There we go. And so a lot of that kind of process comes down to trial and error and just figuring out what ultimately works and looks natural. Next, I created a set alpha node, and that is just to introduce the alpha that exists on the combined paths. I ultimately lost the alpha when I mixed it over this black result in this mix node, and that kind of just eliminated the alpha from the lamp light group at that stage. And then that just kind of carried through. So if you look at it here, the original lamp light group, you'll see that it is in fact there. So there we go. So we'll see the alpha does exist. It is present. But then right when we pipe it down, once we view that mix node, it's now gone because it's just being effectively layered on top of a black solid on the bottom or underneath of this result here. And then we're just reducing the effective opacity over top of the black solid. But as a result, we lost that alpha at this stage. If we look at the adjustments being made here for the speck removal, this is just isolated to the picture frame because of the matte, so it's not happening here. But if we view this subtract or this mix node, you'll see that we do not have the alpha there. And so to figure out where that's coming from, why we do not have the alpha, you just have to step it back in the pipe. And so if we just go to the mix node, you'll see that it's not there, but then it is there in the original again. If we look down here, this is kind of irrelevant because it's just a roto piping into the factor. So it is in fact coming from this. So one way to reintroduce the alpha would be kind of more at the root level earlier on in the pipe. I could have maybe added it in between this mix node here and this mix node right here. And then I could have just piped the alpha result into it down there. And then when it mixes together there, it would be visible. And then we wouldn't need it here. But for all intents and purposes, this got the job done just fine in a similar manner. And so this just reintroduces that alpha. And so there we go. That allows us to then apply the sky to the final result. So if we just view it here, this is just an alpha over node, not a mix. Kind of looks like it because the yellow top part, but it's an alpha over. And the main pipe from the set alpha is then going into the image so that we have that result here with the alpha piping into the image. And then the sky setup is coming into the top image input. And so the final result is layered over top of the sky, right? Because that again is layering on top of the top input, which doesn't make sense, but that's what it's doing. And then if we look at the sky image, that's it here. I'm doing a color balance or applying a color balance just to make it a little more cyan in line with the light color that I have affecting the scene. And then I had this just test color balance node here. I don't think it was doing much. I might have been testing something previously, but when I look back at this recently, it wasn't doing anything, so I just muted it. And then the scale is just scaling it down to the size of the actual render so that it fits within the frame. And then the transform is just moving it into place relatively to where I wanted it, visible outside of the windows. So that was just trial and error as well, just kind of viewing the final result in the main pipe where that is mixing over using the set alpha. And then I just adjusted these values until it looked about right. Just moving it up and moving it down, side to side, etc. And then this mix node is just mixing it over to make sure that it holds to that final resolution or dimensions of the final render result, which is being determined by this scale node. If the scale node was not there, viewing at this mix node again, and we hit M on that to mute it, you'll see that that just kind of expanded up a bit because the image that I saved, like online, it's not the same exact dimensions as my render, right? So that's why I needed that scale node. Otherwise, now if we look at the final result, it's not going to look the way we want it. See, so now we have this like extra border on the top and the bottom, which is not what we want to introduce at this stage. Adds those kind of cinematic bars to it, but this is not how we would want to do that if we did want those. But now if we just unmute that, you'll see that because I have that set to render size, the set to stretch, it's going to force it down to the size of the actual render. And there we go. It just kind of crops it off properly. And then the Gaussian blur is just adding some subtle blur to it to kind of add some fake depth of field. And then that is just adding it over. I might have increased the blur a bit more on that in hindsight, but worked well enough. And so then there's the sky. Now we go to the moon rays. The mix node has been set to add again. The factor was changed down. It was reduced to 0.6. And this is just using the direct volumetric pass where I went over in the previous video how I set that up already. So when I batch rendered it, it batch rendered not just the main scene layer, master layer, beauty pass with all of those AOVs embedded in it. It also rendered out the render layers that I set up for the volumetrics, which I planned on adding on top in comp at this stage, right? So then I just went into the directory where that rendered out and I just dragged it in here. And then now we can see that we have it visible and we're good to go. So this is what that looks like. It's what we would expect it to look like. And so there's a few changes done to it. So if we go to the mix node here, you'll see that the alpha has been knocked back a little bit. This is just because the volumetrics were too strong in the window area, screen left, most notably. And so it was just kind of washing out that area of the frame within the window there. A little too much, looked unnatural, especially looking at the other window, and given that it's nighttime, it just looked overdone. So if we mute the RGB curves, actually we can just unplug the factor. Now we can see what that looks like, right? So it's a little bit too strong, doesn't make much sense, looks weird. So to tone that down a bit, I just piped the alpha, dragged that guy, gotta click off there, down into the image input for this RGB curves node. And then I just adjusted the curve on it just to kind of bring it down a bit. You could have used another node probably to get a similar result here. Maybe like a contrast type node or something. And that kind of just toned back the alpha in that region. And then if we just pipe that into the factor again, view that, that's just toning that down a bit. And then that's coloring that. But let's look at this first before we move on. And so that's the result it's getting us. Much more subtle, believable, looks natural, looks way better. Now, another way to have done this with the volumetrics to maintain these light rays could have been potentially to use a different type of light source, be it in a spotlight or what have you. And then we could have maybe piped a gobo image to break up the light coming out of said light source, either using a plane or tied that gobo directly to the light source itself. And then we could have had broken up light rays coming in through the window the entire way. And so then we wouldn't have just had like solid volumetrics outside of the window, which is basically happening because I have the directional light just blasting through the window into the volume box that I've created. And so outside of the window, it's just solid, but inside of the window, we get the kind of light ray effect because it's coming through effectively naturally because it's just breaking up where we see the window frame geometry, which does make sense. But outside of the window then, it looks solid, right? Which created that more kind of unnatural result. But this is a way to kind of fix that. And so then if we look at the color balance, that's just adjusting the color of the rays. Again, I did this just so that we could get it acting effectively as a mask. So this is where we can kind of put that to use a little bit more. And this color balance is just being used to adjust the color to match up with the actual light coming into the scene from the directional light and the bounce light and all that. And so I just changed the slope to a bit more of a kind of a teal color. And then that's being piped into this mix node right here. And this is just kind of softening the bottom of the rays to make that a more natural. And this mask is achieving that. So this mask is the Beams 01 mask. So if we just change this to mask, select that, it would be this. There we go. And so that is just then again being blurred with a Gaussian blur. X and Y set to 300 to soften it, to feather it out a bit. And then that is being piped into the factor to mask it off. And then this is being piped into the bottom image input, which is being layered over top of whatever's in the top image input, which is just black. And so this is the result that we get. So now I'm just going to go back to view mode, and there we go. Now that we have that, that's being layered on top of what we had previously, which is just that effective combined result after reassembling the light groups and then adding in that sky. And then that is again just being added on top of that result, and we get this. Now I did also reduce the overall factor on this to make it a little more subtle. With it at 1, it was a little bit too clean in terms of how it was adding on top. It looked a little bit too CG. Since there's no clear dust particles or anything breaking it up at all. It looks okay. It's not too bad. Like in some contexts, in certain cases, maybe this would fly. I just wanted it to be a little more subtle just to dial it in and refine it a bit more. So I felt 0.6 was that kind of sweet spot for what I was going for in this case. And so they're still visible. They're still helping to lead the eye toward the center point, which I went over in a previous video. And so they're still doing the job. They're adding a little bit to the overall mood. They're integrated. They look natural. They're the same color as the light affecting the scene. And so we're ready to move on. Now for the ambient atmosphere, if we look at that mix, that's where that's being added in. So that's the same kind of setup here, right? So you'll see that that's what it looks like. It's loaded in. So you'll see down here, I've added in that render layer result here as well. So I just dragged in that image and there we go. Now I should say too, for these volumetric render layers, you could really save them right out of your Arnold render view if you so choose, as just JPEGs even, because we don't need the active AOVs on these layers or anything from that, because we're only using the raw result effectively from those render layers. So if you wanted to, you could just view the beauty result from those render layers in the Arnold render view. Those render layers should render faster, save them out as JPEGs to wherever you want, and then drag them in. That would work too. But for this is what it looks like. That's what we would expect based off the last video where I went over this. And then this is being piped into a mix. I'm doing the same thing where I'm knocking back the alpha just a bit to make it more subtle. And then I'm just coloring it the same as I did for the other one. That then is being piped into the bottom image input of this mix. Again, that's set to add. I dragged the factor down to 0.496 to make it a little bit more subtle relatively than the moon rays. And this is the result again that we get. Now, if we put that up to 1, you'll see what that looks like. So there we go. Adds to the atmosphere a little bit more moody. But again, I wanted the focal point to be that work desk. I didn't want it to be too washed out. I wanted to maintain some semblance of contrast there. So I wanted to take it back a bit more. So I just reduced that factor to 0.496. Just through some trial and error again, right? And this is where it landed. Right there. So next we can add the lamp atmosphere. And so if we just Control-Shift-Left-Click, we'll see what that looks like once that has been added in. All right, so to add that, similar process. I had that render layer set up already, so you can either just let that batch render, drag in the batch rendered, it would be an EXR in that case, or you can just save out of the Arnold render view a JPEG, drag that in, and then we can view what that looks like. That's what we would expect, again, based off the last video where I set that up. And then all I'm doing for that is just adding a color balance to warm it up a bit. And then that is then being piped into the bottom image input as we'd expect into this mix node, changed to add for the blending operation. I did not change the factor at all. 1 seemed to work well, so I just kept it at 1. And again, this is the result that we get. And so there we go. The volumetrics have now been added. We have that extra mood kind of injected into the final result. As we had initially intended to do, and it's looking pretty solid now. Now, this is one method that you can use to go about adding your volumetrics. There's a plethora of ways to really add volumetrics or atmosphere to your final result. This is just one of those. I felt it was pretty clear. You can add frames, clearly label them to see where it's being added in. You could alternatively add them together outside of the main pipe, all of your volumetric passes or render outputs. And you can kind of just mix them together outside of this and then just add them all together in a single spot within the main pipe. And so this is kind of what I did just to demonstrate that here. So first you could just take this moon rays result from the directional light, this render layer, and then just mix it over a black kind of solid effectively, and then just reduce the factor on that relatively to what I did here to 0.6, just to kind of reduce the overall effect of that there. And then you could take the ambient atmosphere from that area light that I have set up here, and then mix that on top of it here using this mix node. Again, doing the same thing, changing the factor on this to 0.496, same relative amount that we did here. And then you can take the lamp atmosphere result from this color balance and then mix it together here with the same relative amount for the factor, which is just 1 unchanged. mix that here, and then you get this kind of combined volumetric result isolated outside of the main pipe. And then you can just mix the whole thing on top of the final result. If we just mute these guys and then just unmute this, I'll show you what that looks like. So this is just a test I did just to demonstrate this. I didn't have this actually part of the final pipe, but you'll see what that looks like. So there you go. It looks the same as it did before. It's just a different way to set it up and integrate it into the final pipe. Now there is another way even. So if we just mute that, unmute these, to set up your volumetrics in the comp. So this I went over at the end of the last video. This would be a way to achieve your volumetric integration using the RGB channels inside of Maya. So I went over this in terms of the Maya side setup in the last video once again. But once you have that final result, this would be isolated to a single render layer. So in some context, it's a little bit cleaner. But so you would ultimately just then drag that in, bring that into your comp inside of Blender, and then you can just use your separate color nodes here, combined with a combined color node to separate out the RGB channels here. And so I just put the moonbeams from that directional light onto the red channel in this case, and then isolated it using these nodes. And then I put the ambient volumetrics onto the blue channel, isolated it using these nodes, and then the same for the lamp volumetrics, and then isolated those to the green channel. And so then those are, at this point, at the combined color node, acting as masks. And then I just use these color balances to adjust the color of them. The blue color here doesn't quite match what I had above, but it's moderately close. And then I just mix them together using these mix nodes, like so. And then you could just kind of reduce this to adjust the amount, mix one of these over itself like I did above, over a kind of a black solid to reduce that if you wanted to as well. And then you would just add that setup using a mix node into this, into the main pipe. And that's kind of an alternate way to go about adding your volumetrics to your final comp setup as well. Now you are somewhat limited in this method because you can only really assign your volumetrics to the RG or B channels. And so you can kind of only group them into 3 groups effectively, which for all intents and purposes usually works just fine. I haven't really encountered a situation where I was limited in that regard. I'm sure there might be some situations that would come up where you might want to separate them in more of a specific way, but I haven't really encountered it myself, and I've done a lot of volumetric rendering. So this is just another way to do it though. Now if we go over to the lamp saturation tweak, you'll see that if we just click on this again, we'll see our volumetric result, or the result with those added in. And this is where we are sitting. And then this is what the lamp saturation tweak is doing. So this is a very subtle adjustment. Again, it's just slightly increasing the saturation. Primarily, the intent was to increase the saturation in the center of the frame where the lamp exists. Now, ultimately, this is increasing the saturation of the overall result that we have up until this point. And so of the volumetrics that might exist in this space of the moonlight group result, as well as of the light or the lamp light group result, as well as any underlying surface material colors that we're getting from this combined result as well. Now it's most visible on the lamp because the lamp is in the middle of the frame. And so I felt it was suitable enough just to put this adjustment here. I wanted the eye to be drawn there anyways. If it increased the saturation of other elements, then that was totally okay with me. If you wanted to isolate it to the lamp, you could just add this saturation setup like somewhere in here before it gets mixed over the moon light group. But again, this worked just fine in this case. So to do this, I created a mix node, created a general roto shape, and then I blurred it to feather the edge a bit. And here I have a denoise node as well. I don't think this is actually doing anything because I denoised out of Maya. I could probably just mute that, to be honest. And it won't be any different. And then I just took that result coming basically out of that result where we had the volumetrics ultimately being added on top from this node. And then I piped that into the hue and saturation value node that I created here. And then I just increased the saturation very slightly to 1.1. And that's what that looks like. And then I just mixed that on top. So this is ultimately increasing the saturation of the entire image. But then I'm isolating it just to the center where that lamp is using the roto shape that I created here. And then I named it what was it? Oh, I just used the same one as before, the lamp roto. So that's piping into the mix node then. It's isolating that effect to that area, and that's how that is being achieved. Then here we have a glare or halation diffusion adjustment, effectively adding a slight amount of bloom to the highlight regions of the render. So we're just taking that result there. I just created a reroute node there, which made that dot basically, just to kind of organize it a little better. That's being piped into this glare node, which is changed to fog glow. It's set to high for the quality. And then the threshold is at 1 and the mix is at 1. The size is at 7. That made it subtle enough. It isolated it, constrained it just to the highlights, which predominantly I wanted it to only apply to the lamp anyways. So this did just fine for me. And then I mixed it over using add and reduced the factor to 0.2 just to keep it very subtle. So that's the effect that that's having. Now if we view it at the reroute here, you'll see what it looks like without that. And then again, with it. So it's creating a very subtle kind of halation effect. This can often happen naturally in certain types of lenses, or if you attach a diffusion filter onto your lens, you can kind of achieve this effect as well. It's just kind of a way of dirtying up the lens a little bit, as it were, making it seem a little bit more natural, believable, and realistic. Just by adding those subtle tweaks or lens effects to your final result. And then down here we have the lens distortion, which is just another kind of lens effect ultimately. I could have framed those, called it lens effects or whatever. That would have been cool too, maybe a little bit more organized. But this is what that looks like. There we go. So you'll see that kind of pulled out the render just a little bit. So this is before, and then this is after. There you go. And so to achieve this, I just dialed in the values just a little bit, just through trial and error, testing it out. I wanted to keep this very subtle as well. I didn't want it to come across like a fisheye lens or anything wild. Now, often in real world scenarios, like if it's live action or any kind of photography you might be doing, you're usually aiming to remove any kind of lens distortion. But when you're doing any kind of CG work, it's often beneficial to add just a tiny bit to the final result if you're going for a somewhat realistic final look. It prevents it from looking too CG and too sharp and clean. So it just brings in that added level of realism to the final result. But you do, again, want to keep that very subtle. To save this out then, you can just create a file output node, specify where you want that saved. JPEG, you can pick your file format, adjust your quality, what have you. Or you can go up to render and then go render image, and then if you go to view render, it'll bring up your kind of Blender render window, and then you should see it render here, and then you can just kind of save it out from this window once it finishes, kind of like you would out of the Arnold render window basically. Save it as a JPEG wherever you want, and that would be just fine. So from there, once I saved that out as a JPEG on my hard drive, I then brought it into Lightroom to do a final kind of polish pass and just do some final tweaks, grades, slight vignetting on the overall image, since it was, again, just a little bit quicker for me to do it that way rather than just messing around by adding some nodes and waiting for this thing to load, or having to do like a lower resolution render to do more tweaks and stuff quickly. So next, let's just jump into Lightroom. I'll go over quickly what I did there, and then this is a wrap. So I'll see you in the next section. All right, so here we are in Lightroom, and so this is the final result after making my Lightroom adjustments, and I'm just gonna hit backslash, and so that's basically what it looked like right out of comp, out of Blender. This is what that final result looked like. And so this pass in Lightroom was all about enhancing what was already working and giving it that final cinematic edge. And so I started at the top in the basics panel. I adjusted the temp slightly, just made it a little bit cooler to lock in the color temperature that I wanted. It's a very subtle difference. If we just put this to 0, you'll see what that's doing. So I wanted to kind of just cool it off a little bit, just to make things feel a little bit more nighttime across the board within the image. Then I made some subtle tweaks to the exposure, and then the shadows, whites, highlights, all of that. And that's just mainly to bring out a bit more depth without overcorrecting anything either, right? And so You'll see what adjusting the shadows here does just by lifting it up and then reducing it down. So I just reduced those shadows to kind of introduce some more contrast and keep the focus again on the center of the image. Naturally, based off of how the scene was lit, the shadows were predominantly present on the outer edge of the frame. And so just by making sure those were darker, it helped to draw focus into the center of the frame. And then the highlights, just by brightening those, since the brighter portion of the frame is predominantly in the center around that work desk. That's where I focused the light intentionally out of Maya. So then just by increasing those highlights, we're then drawing focus more to the center of the frame and that focal point. So that's what it was all about, right? Just kind of pushing and pulling those values to kind of find the right balance at the end of the day. So that's what I was doing here. And then I reduced the clarity a bit to -5. I'll often do that just to kind of haze things out, add a little bit of a bloom to the highlights within any kind of photograph that I might have taken, or sometimes in any renders as well. Because you'll see if you reduce that, things will kind of start to soften out a bit. Now you want to be subtle with this, you don't want to overdo it, otherwise it starts to look like you're kind of rubbing Vaseline on the lens and it looks unnatural. You also don't want to overdo it in terms of increasing it if you decided to do that, because then it can start to look really grungy and not very appealing. So I just reduced that to -5. Dehaze, increase that to +15, just to add some depth and kind of take back that volumetrics or the haze and the kind of increase the contrast a little bit in the center of the frame. Then I moved to the tone curve, adding contrast by deepening the shadows slightly. You'll see I have a bit of an S-curve here, slightly brought those points down just a little bit. You can hold Command and drag around your points and it'll move them to kind of a smaller degree. Whereas if you don't, it'll be kind of a little bit more sensitive when you try to move those. And then I lifted the black point too at the very bottom just to kind of introduce a bit of a fade. You'll see if we bring that down all the way, the outer edge where the shadows are kind of fell to more of a stark black. So I'm just going to undo that. You'll see it's a very slight, very subtle fade that was then introduced just by lifting this point just a little bit. I would have probably held Command there and then just dragged it up a bit. And that's what that did for me. So subtlety is the name of the game here when doing any of these adjustments. It all adds up. Then I also pulled it down, the highlights, just a touch to avoid anything blowing out and to keep the tonal balance feeling cohesive overall. And so if we just drag this point up, you'll see what that does. If you look at the center of the lamp here, so if we just kind of drag that down, you don't want to do this too much. Again, you want to be very kind of cautious when making many of these adjustments or any of these adjustments. But you'll see what that's doing as we move that point around. And so just by kind of bringing it down a bit, it just kind of adds that level of balance and kind of, again, cohesion tonally throughout the final image and gives it a little bit more of a cinematic feel just by doing that. From there, I jumped down into the color mixer. I made some small tweaks. Some of them didn't do much at the end of the day. I might have actually used a preset, to be honest, initially when building this edit up. And so you'll see the greens were reduced, the saturation. I'm not sure why that would have been down otherwise, since there's not really any visible green in the final render, at least nothing noticeable. So this isn't doing much for us. Now the yellow, by it being reduced, just makes it a little bit more subtle in terms of the warm light and that level of warmth in the center of the frame. That could have been increased a bit maybe. That's kind of preference. I wouldn't, again, overdo it or take it back too far. Otherwise it might start looking a little bit unnatural. So I found that, what was it? -47, I guess. That worked pretty well there. And now the orange, same thing. It's just about finding that sweet spot, dragging it to the low end, to the high end, dialing it in, and then feeling out what works best based off of, again, your creative direction, what you're going for. So for the orange, at the end of the day, I settled on -10. It probably could have been maybe a little bit higher. It doesn't look too bad with a little bit more saturation in there. It makes it pop a bit more, but for all intents and purposes, -10 worked just fine. And so you'll see I did similar changes for all of these. The luminance, you'll see what that does for the blue. That'll make that punch out a little bit more if we increase it. Any of the blues, those moon rays, all of that. But at the same time, if you decrease it a lot, it'll start looking really weird and unnatural. So you do want to be careful when doing these. This is not a raw image or photograph. It is a JPEG, so you are kind of limited in your dynamic range in terms of how much you can push and pull these settings. And then for the color grading, you'll see I've introduced a little bit of cool tones to the midtones and the highlights. If we just hit the eyeball here, you'll see what that does. So again, that's just increasing the amount of kind of cohesion throughout the image and kind of making things feel a little bit more nighttime across the board. That was the intent or the idea there anyways. I did want to be subtle with this. Again, if you drag it out too much, it's going to start looking a little bit odd and again, unnatural. So ultimately it comes down to what you're going for and your kind of creative direction, but that's what I settled on. And then I added some sharpening. That helps to kind of compensate a little bit after adding that clarity or reducing the clarity, because you'll see again, that kind of softens things out. You lose some detail. So by sharpening it, it kind of compensates for that and sharpens up the textures just a little bit more. Now you do want to be subtle with this. Again, if you do it too much, it's going to start to look a little bit odd and not good. So I just settled on 34 for the amount, and then that was the values for the rest of the settings. From there, I went down to the vignette, applied a bit of a vignette. You'll see what that's doing. Very subtle. You'll see the top of the frame here and around here get a little bit darker with it on. That's off, that's on. So again, subtlety, name of the game. It all adds up at the end of the day. So that was just ultimately just to kind of pull focus a little bit more toward the center of the frame. Added a little bit of grain just to dirty things up a bit, add a little bit more realism. Was not completely necessary. That's kind of personal preference, of course. You could just not have grain as well. I just wanted to kind of dirty things up a little bit there. It does, to some context, make sense too. Since it is nighttime, the ISO might have to be increased depending on what camera this is being shot on. You might end up seeing some noise realistically in a scene such as this. And then for the calibration, I used it just to subtly enhance the warm versus cool color separation, pushing the blues and the shadows cooler and the reds or the warmer tones just a little bit warmer. So you kind of just have to experiment with this, push and pull these values to see what it's going to do for you. It can drastically have an effect on the colors within your final image, so I would be careful with these again. Play it safe, keep it subtle. If you're going to do anything drastic like this, at this point I would just start changing the light color, probably out of render. So you probably should have planned a little bit more intentionally if you're going to go this far with it prior. But again, just keep it subtle and you should be good to go. So the final idea here was not to overhaul the look, it was just to enhance it, to keep the saturation and contrast just a little bit stronger than the base render, maintain that soft cinematic fade and overall look, and then bring it all together with a cohesive tone. It was subtle, but effective. So just a couple quick tips, or a quick tip at least, I should say, before we call it quits here. If you hit L on the keyboard, that'll help you kind of do your edits as you're moving through, or just to check them. Like I usually wouldn't edit with the L key hit and kind of in this mode here. But I do use that often just to kind of check it to see how things are looking and to kind of get a new perspective on it. If you hit L, everything around the image will go completely black. You can, of course, use that as well. But that's just kind of a quick tip if you are editing in Lightroom at any point. But with that said, that's a wrap. That's how I kind of finished things off here for the Vickery Attic and this kind of nighttime look that I applied to the scene, to this image. I hope you enjoyed the video. A little longer than the last two for sure. I hope you learned a thing or two. If you did, feel free to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.